Hi, it's Brenna. I've had so many of you ask about working with children on the autism spectrum in a child-centered play therapy approach. And so in order to address lots of you wondering, I figured it would be easier to just record my thoughts. So I wanted to kind of dive into what I have noticed, what I've observed, what I think is important when we're working with children on the spectrum. And I guess before I even dive into that, I think it's important to keep in mind two things, and then I'll kind of unpack the specific details. First and foremost, we need to be very clear in our interactions with parents, caregivers, adults in the child's life that this is not an attempt to fix the child. This is not an attempt to change the child. And there are a lot of parents that think that once they've received an autism spectrum diagnosis, that every therapy in the world is needed so that they can fix what's going on or change the circumstances. And I want to make it very clear that neurodivergent kids are not in need of fixing and they're not in need of changing. Their brains are wired differently. So not only do we need to have that mindset, but we need to help parents understand that we are not going to all of a sudden make them want to socialize in a different way. We're not going to make them all of a sudden want to look someone in the eyes when they speak. We're not going to all of a sudden rewire their brains because this was a congenital developmental issue, and therefore it cannot be reversed or undone. Now, can a child on the spectrum gain things from the child-centered play therapy approach? Of course, yes. So we pivot away from fixing and changing them to what they will be able to get out of the child-centered play therapy approach, which are coping skills. I think first and foremost, you have kids that really are struggling to cope because they are different and their brains are different and they know that the rest of the world and they don't always see things the same way. So it makes them feel inadequate and they need coping skills. They develop an emotional vocabulary and an emotional intelligence, which are both extremely important. They develop resilience. They are able to build self-esteem. That is huge, especially for kids on the spectrum. They really need to like who they are, accept who they are, trust themselves, and have a better sense of self-confidence. So that's a really big piece. And most importantly, self-control. So are they able to handle themselves differently? Yes. Are they able to regulate? Yes. Are they able to build coping and resilience? Yes. Are they able to build an emotional vocabulary? Yes. So all of those things. But that's what neurotypical kids gain out of the child-centered play therapy approach too. So it's very important that we set expectations clearly and help parents and caregivers and adults understand we're not changing, we're not fixing, but here is what your child can get out of this process. All right, so with those two disclaimers out of the way, now we'll move into the 5 things that I think are worth noting when you're working with a child on the spectrum and what that might look like. So as a general rule, children on the spectrum move through the phases at a much slower pace than neurotypical kids. So what I mean by that is we've now seen studies that show an average length of time for the child-centered model is 30 to 40 weeks. I think that pushes neurodivergent kids probably to 50 to 60 weeks. So the phases last longer, the stages last longer, and their progress is slower. That is not to say that it does not work. It is not to say that it's not an appropriate intervention. It's just that they process things at a slower pace, and therefore they move through the entire process a little bit more slowly. So that is very important to understand, because what will end up happening is you will find yourself questioning if this is working at all, if this is helping at all. Why haven't I seen the change and the progress yet? Why does this seem to be stuck? Why are we not moving as quickly as I would expect? We kind of end up with an internal clock as a child-centered play therapist. The more you do this, you kind of get a sense of how many weeks it's been, where the child should be, what they should be doing. And it's not that it's not a cognitive process that's taking place. It's more of a subconscious thing. And you will find yourself questioning everything with a child on the spectrum because it's just not following pace. All right. So another thing that I've noticed with kids on the spectrum is they are much more concrete. Their brains are just wired in a much more concrete way. They do tend to see everything through a more black and white lens, and that affects their play. So it's not that it's good or bad or anything, it's just different. And so they are much more concrete. They're much more black and white. They don't always do well, nor do they know what to do when they're given full autonomy and free rein to be in charge and to make executive decisions. So they will often struggle with imaginative play. They will struggle with creative play. They will struggle with narrative play. And sometimes they will struggle to play altogether at the beginning because they are much more likely to want directions and directives and expectations. The vague, nebulous nature of the child-centered approach is not initially an easy fit for children on the spectrum. So I've had kids on the spectrum that stand in the middle of the stand. I said that on purpose. Stand in the middle of the room for many, many weeks straight. They just talked the entire time about nothingness. I mean, it was important to them, but it was just blabbering for an entire hour for like 3 or 4 weeks straight until they finally got up the nerve to look at one toy. And then they immediately put it back and went back to talking. So they really do not understand and feel comfortable with the vague nature of the child-centered approach. So that's really important to know. More often than not, you will notice that kids on the spectrum will not conventionally play. They tend to reenact or recreate things that they know or that they like or that they've seen. So a lot of their play is repetitive, first of all, but second of all, it is concocted elsewhere, and then they just reenact it in the playroom. So you will see them reenact scenes from TV shows. You will see them reenact parts of movies. You will see them duplicate video games. That is the really common one because, unfortunately, there's a really high level of comorbidity with autism spectrum disorders and really, really high amounts of screen time. So they almost all play video games a lot, and therefore their play becomes often very video game driven. And they will recreate levels and lives, and you get to power up, and you found the secret portal, and you're down to 40 health. And so you'll hear a lot of reenactment and recreation of things that they are really familiar with in their play. Fourth, they are typically very comfortable playing alone. So whereas with neurotypical kids, they start out playing independently and individually, and then there's kind of that breakthrough where they ask you and invite you into their play, and it becomes collaborative. With neurodivergent kids, they will sometimes play by themselves for the entirety of their treatment, and they don't ever feel compelled to invite you, and they don't particularly need or want collaborative play. And that doesn't make it any less effective. It's just the way that they prefer to play. So it's helpful to know that just because they haven't switched to collaborative play, that is some kind of indication that there's something wrong or there's some kind of hiccup in the process. And then finally, you will often see a similar play theme again and again and again and again. You will see the same pattern for many, many weeks, and you can start to question if they're actually making any progress or having any shifts within those themes. But my caveat or disclaimer is it does not mean that it is not helpful. It does not mean that it is not working. They are gaining all of those things that we talked about at the beginning, all of those benefits that we discussed they can acquire. They are doing that even when they're reenacting the same video game again and again and again. As long as you are remaining true to the child-centered approach, as long as you are using the 4 pillars, you are using all of the skills that you've learned, they are absorbing all of that, and it is making a difference, even when their play seems very habitual and patterned and consistent. That is not a problem. That is just the way that their brains are wired. And they are still internalizing everything that you are adding in as those therapeutic guide rails for kids on the spectrum. So I hope that is helpful. It is a unique population, and so it's very helpful to understand kids with ASD, what that looks like, how it changes things. But it really doesn't change anything that we do. It's just helpful to understand how it looks different in the playroom and how things play out throughout the treatment process. So hope you find that helpful. Please reach out if you have any questions. We'll talk again soon.